Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Let's get back to the geopolitics coming out of the Middle East. The Syrian President Bashar Al-Assad is now in Moscow after rebel forces took control of Damascus over the weekend, ending nearly a century of his family's rule. His toppling is sending shockwaves throughout the Middle East and will be a major blow to Russia and Iran. President Joe Biden hailed Assad's fall in an address to the nation on Sunday. Take a listen.
It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty, as we all turn to the question of what comes next.
All right, that was President Biden with some comments Sunday regarding what's happening in Syria. Let's get some more analysis on this unfolding situation. Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, joins us from Washington, D.C. via Zoom. Aaron, thanks so much for joining us here. Do we have any idea who's in charge over there in Syria?
Well, right now it's, and thanks for having me. Right now it's Ahmed Shara, who's Namdegir, a.k.a. also known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani. Born in Saudi, parents were originally from the Golan Heights, which is why he took the name al-Gulani. Formerly associated with both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. He's evolved over the last 5 or 6 years. Running the province of Idlib relatively inclusively, reaching out to Kurds and to the Druze. It's hard to know. Rebelling is hard, governing is frankly a lot harder. And the track record here for overthrowing Arab authoritarians is not terribly uplifting. Egypt, Mubarak's gone. A more repressive authoritarian military government replaced him. Tunisia, Ben Ali, aspiring democracy, now an authoritarian government. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's pretty dysfunctional, a lot of disappointments there. Yemen, Abdullah Saleh overthrown, the Houthis are in charge of much of the country. Syria may have a better chance. Headlines appear to be pretty good. Not a lot of repression or retribution yet. Golani's singing a pretty moderate tune, invited the international press in, sending signals to the Alawi community in Latakia that not interested in retribution. I guess, guys, the question will be power sharing. It'll be power sharing, and it'll be whether or not the Islamic principles and strictures of these Sunni political Islamists can be reconciled with the largely traditional secular Syrian elite, and whether or not, you can govern. Syria's broke and heavily indebted to the Iranians. Oil industry is muzzled to 2.5 billion barrels a day. It pales before the larger producers. So it's going to be a real heavy lift.
Syria borders what? Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and also Turkey. Does the response by one dictate the response overall by the others?
Well, it's been the playground for external intervention since the beginning of the civil war. The Turks have had a huge role to play, as you pointed out, Iran, Hezbollah, and of course, Russia doesn't share contiguous borders, but was the key broker and savior, redeemer of the Assad regime when it was challenged in 2015. I think that the prospects for external intervention are still there. And by the way, the Israelis need to be definitely put into the mix. Prospects for external intervention are there, but the real troublemakers, the Iranians, I would argue the Russians, Hezbollah, they've been set back. There's more agency now for Syrians to function and focus on Syria than at any time in the last decade or so. The Turks are now the big boys on the proverbial block, And their motives are mixed here, but they will be the great power, the regional power to watch.
All right, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. Aaron David Miller, he's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, joining us from Washington, D.C. And, one of the questions I have ongoing will be what role, if any, will the U.S. play in how this thing develops? And
we didn't mention we will, for the flow of refugees, which from Syria has kind of shaped the political landscape of Europe.
Yep. And I'm just kind of seeing some of the reporting today. 2.5 million of refugees have gone to Turkey and some 3 million to Europe, to your point, John. So, again, a fluid situation over there. We'll keep up with the reporting.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Let's refocus on what is happening on the geopolitical front, because clearly front and center for many investors, particularly what's happening in Syria over the last several days. Kirsten Fontenrose joins us. She's a president of Red 6 International. She's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and was a senior director for the Middle East in the last U.S. administration. Kirsten, what's happening in the Middle East, and why is that happening now?
It's an interesting confluence of potentially unrelated events in the Middle East that is all leading to things like Iranian foreign policy imploding, Russia's model of taking fringe groups from zero to hero imploding, Israel's ability to potentially uproot the threats it faces from several fronts increasing. So we're Turkey's diplomatic efforts that looked a little precarious beginning to pay off. So there are a whole lot of effects coming out of these potentially unrelated events. In terms of things like Iran's implosion, they've spent years arming other militaries and militias to antagonize their adversaries. And now each of these is being decapitated, except for the Houthis in Yemen. And so Iran is going to be forced to update its foreign policy. And we should be watching them for the choices they make. For instance, will it double down on its militia model and press its militias in Iraq to stage more frequent attacks? Or is it going to build up the Houthis' capabilities in Yemen to interrupt shipping in the Red Sea, perhaps even beyond the Red Sea to waters farther northwest or south? Or is it going to offer more support to groups like the Polisario in the North Africa that it has supported before? Or will it completely flip the text on this and rush to complete its fighter jet purchase from Russia out of fear that Israel may choose to hit them while they're down, which is a realistic fear? Again, we could see that it might even be easier for Iran and the U.S. to reach a nuclear agreement now, since one of the key sticking points was the activity of Iran's militias that are now crippled. So we'll be watching to see how Iran plays this. All we know so far is that it is confirmed through foreign ministry statements that the supply route with which it supplies weapons to Hezbollah through Syria has been severed. So this is to Israel's advantage. And the Iranian foreign minister was part of a meeting in Doha last Saturday in which several Arab foreign ministers joined him, and they issued a joint statement calling for a ceasefire and for a political solution in Iran. So it's interesting to watch Iran now try to be part of a solution instead of remaining part of the problem for all the Syrians who are celebrating in the streets.
Was the murderous Assad regime ever a stabilizing factor in that part of the world? And how do we gauge whether or not the country has gone from the frying pan into the fire?
To a certain extent, you're right. The Assad regime was stabilizing only in the sense that it was predictable. And many of the countries, including Gulf states and Israel, at some points thought it was better to deal with the devil they knew than deal with an unknown devil who would potentially be an Islamist jihadist state, as we may be looking at now. So that fear led many of them to think, if we can keep him in place, we at least know what his red lines are, what his capabilities are, and we don't see him making active moves against any of us. He is simply enabling things that threaten us, like housing Hezbollah if you're Israel, or like enabling the Captagon trade if you're the Gulf or Jordan.
So, Kirsten, what role do you believe the U.S. should play, will play, if any, in Syria?
Well, right now we're watching the U.S. administration really engage in some diplomacy, trying to understand who the players are and wanting to stay involved and up to date, really urging for ceasefires, urging for things like humanitarian assistance to continue to Syria. The Donald Trump team has made it clear that they do not think there's a U.S. interest involved in getting engaged in this conflict right now. They want to watch it play out. They are making statements about Israel's right to definitely defend itself during all of this against whatever may come. And they are making statements about how this disavows Russia's promises to the region that it is a strong security partner. So you are seeing them weigh in on how they're reading the tea leaves, but not making any promises on a role the U.S. would play.
Does Israel use this now as the opportunity to address all their security concerns as it related to the north of the border?
That is the big question. It sure could. The question that everyone is holding their breath on is, what will Israel do? We are already watching them this week strike chemical weapons sites and stores of long-range missiles inside Syria to prevent either Iran-backed militias, Russia, or frankly, unknown factions of HTS from taking possession of those. And it's striking air defense radars, anti-aircraft batteries, and military aircraft on the ground in Syria as well to ensure that Israel can continue its operations to erase weapon stockpiles that could threaten Israel in the future if it did fall into these hands. And note also that this would give them a clear path to fly over Syrian airspace en route to Iran if desired. But we could also see Israel choose a path where they work with a new government in Syria to potentially establish peace along their shared border. In fact, they may have already made an overture to President Assad in Syria just before his ouster, offering to encourage the U.S. to throttle back sanctions against him in exchange for him helping to halt the flow of weapons from Iran to Hezbollah through Syria. And there's a hint already of the possibility that Israel could also now reach out to HTS or the developing transitional government inside Syria. And in that, the indication is that HTS has deconflicted its operations near the Israeli border in areas like Quneitra with the Israelis. So could this pave a way for that border to quiet down and for peace there to be cemented? Israel is logically concerned about Syria falling into the hands of Islamist extremists and would not feel any peace was secure as long as that ideology ruled Syria. But peace on that border in the near to midterm would definitely allow them to focus on things they need to finish with Hamas and Hezbollah.
Hey, Kirsten, just about 30 seconds left. How big of a blow is the fall of this Assad regime to President Putin and Russia?
So the blow is that the Russian model is to support unpopular dictators across the globe to gain access and concessions to valuable resources in their countries. Syria was an example. So we're in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. And Russia has relied on its air base in Syria to fly people in and extracted gold and other minerals out. So it's been more than even just the relationship with Syria and its access to that naval base in Tartus that puts it so close to NATO and on the Med. But now their operations in Africa and other places are curtailed because of their reliance on that air base in Syria. So to what extent in the long term this will be curtailed depends on the relationship it develops and the deal it strikes for use of the air base by whatever government is stood up in Syria. Yep. We also now see Turkey saying it will not allow Russian vessels to pass through the Dardanelles until Russia makes peace with Ukraine. So the fall in Syria is also impacting Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine.
All right. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us. Kirsten Fontenrose, president of Red 6 International. Again, the latest on a continuing developing story in Syria and in the greater Middle East. I guess the one constant is turmoil, it seems, uncertainty, change in that part of the world. And we'll keep an eye on that.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. Let's start off with a little M&A. Nice busy Monday. I like that. Mondelez said to mull a takeover of U.S. chocolate maker Hershey. This is going to be a big deal. I mean, Hershey's got a market cap of like $40 billion, another $10 billion of debt, so $50 billion of market cap for enterprise value. Jen Bartashus, she covers this part of the world for Bloomberg Intelligence on the retail side. Hey, Jen, why is Mondelez considering this deal for Hershey?
Hi, Paul. So really, when we look at the deal, it's about how are they going to prop up sales? How are they going to continue to grow share? And they've been very open that tacking on to their portfolio is one of the methods that they do in order to really continue to grow as a company. But this is a big deal. And so it would have to be really, it's really considered a transformational deal at this size.
Can you explain to everybody this mysterious entity known as the Hershey Trust and how they have to cooperate in this?
Absolutely. So Hershey is, has a long history, and about 80% of their shares, they have a dual class share structure, and about 80% of voting shares are held by the Hershey Trust, which means that they have to approve any kind of deal. And this is really just because Hershey as a company is that Hershey Trust uses money from Hershey in order to support charities, right? And so the approval of the trust is required, but in addition to that, Pennsylvania law also requires that the Office of the Attorney General be provided with notice of a deal, and that office has the ability to stop a transaction if they think that the fiduciary obligations of the trust will not be met. So there are a lot of steps structurally in place that could make such a takeover of Hershey really difficult.
All right, what does our antitrust analyst Jennifer Rhee, what does she say about this deal? Will the DOJ, the FTC, and all the regulators, DC, will they allow this deal to go through?
Well, that's the next stumbling block. You know, the FTC has been really reticent with regards to big deals, especially in the last 2 years. When you look at market share, which is really one of the things that their decision would hinge off of, Hershey has over 37% of the U.S. market share in chocolate. Mondelez has just under 2%. So again, you're not combining two huge market shares, but together it would continue to be the largest market share in the United States. And that is higher than what Mars has as well.
And they tried to do this before, right?
They did. They tried this in 2016, and back in 2016, the enterprise value of Hershey was only $25 billion. Today, it's as Paul said at the opening, closer to $50 billion. So, they walked away last time because they weren't able to get all of the approvals in place, and the cost they weren't able to offer the premium that Hershey was looking for. So, there are a lot of questions of whether this deal would actually go through, and if an offer could be made that would be tempting enough for Hershey.
All right, Jen, thanks so much for joining us. Jen Bartashus, she covers all the retail stuff for Bloomberg Intelligence. Gives some thoughts on this deal. Mondelez taking a look at Hershey. So
I'm thinking chocolate-covered mac cheese.
Sure, why not? That could be a new thing. You got to do product extension. I don't know, I pitched the Hershey Trust 1 billion times to sell, and it got nowhere. So I'll be interested to see
and you had an in.
Who finally gets paid here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
More news flow here today. We're going to stay on top of it. A Marine veteran who used a chokehold on an agitated subway rider was acquitted Monday in a death that became a prism for differing views about public safety, valor, and vigilantism. Let's break it down. We have Myles Miller joining us here, Bloomberg's managing editor, here in our studio. Myles, what's going on here? Give us a background of the story and what happened today.
So this goes back to May 1st, 2023. Jordan Neely, a Michael Jackson impersonator, is on a train and he's begging for money. And it starts out with just begging for money, and then it turns into something which Daniel Penny, a former Marine, found threatening. He decided to place Neely in a chokehold to restrain him, and it wound up taking his life. Now, in covering, what happened after that, he, obviously there was a video of it and all of that. He didn't initially give get charged. He then was charged days later after protests, and when he was charged with initially manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. Manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. So what happened on Friday is that the jury told the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked and could not come to an agreement on that tougher charge, being guilty of manslaughter.
And boy, did this touch a nerve. I mean, just walking in Midtown yesterday, the number of free penny stickers on lampposts elsewhere, being in the subway, confronted by someone who may be mentally unstable. The threat there as a subway rider, as an individual, it just enhanced by that atmosphere.
Yeah, and the jurors ultimately decided today that his actions weren't criminal when he held Jordan Neely in that chokehold to prevent what he thought would be danger to other people in that car. The jurors came to that decision this morning. He was acquitted, and there were cheers outside of the court. There were people there in support and in protest to him. In fact, Jordan Neely's father was inside the courtroom, shouted, had to be removed by court officers.
How much of this, in your opinion, sort of mirrors, we have to go pretty far back, but the subway vigilante case in the form of Bernie Goetz?
Yeah, I was in the courtroom the day that Daniel Penny was brought in, the day he was let out of the 5th Precinct, and that comparison had been made by so many legal scholars, and it would appear again today that that this was a determination by these jurors that in fact this was a case of a person trying to step in to help, and they felt that he was just trying to help, and he didn't mean to take this person's life, and drawing obviously comparisons to Bernie Goetz.
So this case, this is according to the AP, the case amplified many American fault lines, among them race, politics, crime, urban life, mental illness, and homelessness. Mr. Neely was black. Mr. Penny is white. Did the judge even acknowledge that type of stuff, or is they trying to really stay to
they stayed to the merits of this case. I think that, obviously outside the courtroom, and the windows were open in the courtroom today and throughout the trial, inside the courtroom, you could hear the chants of people who were on both sides of the divide here. And in fact, they called for a mistrial today, the defense team, because they said that was going to, that was going to make sure the jury wasn't impartial. And it actually turned out the other way. The jury found that in this case, Daniel Penny did not mean to do this, and it's really interesting because there was a case just like this in Brooklyn. Another guy was threatening people on the train. This other guy went up to him, confronted him, and the Brooklyn DA said, "There's no case here." This was a guy who was trying to do the right thing. The guy wound up dying, and it drew parallels to this case. The only thing is, in both the race of both of those people were the same in Brooklyn. In this case, it was different, and it was obviously a charge environment.
What was the makeup of the jury here? And did they all say they were frequent users of the subway?
I looked at a sketch. I looked at a sketch of the jurors, and it was a mix of New York City. And they questioned: do people, in their voir dire process, do you take the subway? Do you know anything about this case? It's kind of impossible to find a jury that didn't know anything about this case because it was a fever pitch when this happened.
Can we pivot real quick and get the update on the United Health Group executive Brian Thompson, his murder in Midtown?
Yeah, so this morning in Altoona, Pennsylvania, police there held a man for questioning in connection with this shooting. The man was in a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. For some reason, I think he was trying to pay for something at the McDonald's and had to show an ID. He had multiple fake IDs. People at that McDonald's called local police. When they called and they came, they found that this man had multiple identifications and a gun with a suppressor on him. Police from the NYPD are headed to Altoona, Pennsylvania right now. It would make sense that this person who's being questioned could be the same person because, of course, they believe he took a bus out of the bus terminal in Washington Heights. One of the routes that you can do is go to Pennsylvania. They had been searching all weekend for the gun, and if this is correct, if police are able to bore this out, it would appear that gun wasn't in Central Park, but rather on him. Of course, this weekend they found a book bag they believe linked to him and some other evidence. But they had not been able to find definitive DNA leading them to the suspect.
Myles, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice.
Appreciate you reporting. Myles Miller, Bloomberg Managing Editor, keeping us up to date on breaking news throughout the day. And there's a lot going on here. We appreciate getting a few minutes of his time.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern, on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.